When I first saw the flyer, I thought it was just another community event. The words, "Unlock your potential and discover the real you," were written in bold, accompanied by an image of a serene sunset over mountains. It seemed harmless enough, and honestly, I was curious. My life at the time felt stagnant, and I was craving something, anything, to break the monotony. The event promised free entry, so I decided to check it out. It was held in a cozy meeting hall on the edge of town, a place I'd passed 100 times but never entered. When I arrived, the room was filled with friendly faces, all smiling and chatting as if they were lifelong friends. A woman greeted me at the door, handing me a pamphlet with phrases like, "Awaken your spirit" and "Live your truth." I remember thinking, hey, this is a bit cheesy, but I'll give it a chance. The session began with a man stepping onto the stage. He looked ordinary, gray suit, glasses, and a kind smile, but when he spoke, his voice commanded the room. He talked about breaking free from societal chains, finding inner peace, and achieving true happiness. The crowd seemed mesmerized, hanging on his every word. To my surprise, I found myself nodding along. What he said resonated with me, as if he understood all the frustrations and doubts I'd been carrying. After the speech, the audience broke into smaller groups for exercises. We were told to share our deepest fears and dreams with strangers. It felt uncomfortable but also liberating. By the end of the evening, I left feeling lighter, almost hopeful. But that was just the beginning. A few days later, I received an email from the event organizer thanking me for attending. The email invited me to a follow-up session, described as an opportunity to dive deeper into self-discovery with a smaller, more focused group. Normally, I would have dismissed it, but something about that first evening had stuck with me. I felt understood for the first time in a long time, so I decided to go. This time, the meeting was held in a more intimate setting, a quiet lodge just outside of town. The atmosphere was warm and inviting, with soft music playing and candles flickering on every table. The leader, the same man who had spoken at the first session, welcomed each of us personally as we arrived. He looked directly into my eyes and said, "You've taken the first step toward freedom. That takes courage." The session started with a meditation exercise. As we sat in a circle, he guided us through deep breathing and visualization techniques. His voice was soothing, and for the first time in years, my mind felt clear. Afterward, he introduced the idea of the Circle of Unity, a group of like-minded individuals committed to helping each other achieve enlightenment. He said joining the circle would require dedication but promised it would lead to a life of fulfillment. I was intrigued but hesitant. The idea of a circle of unity sounded a little cult-like, though I quickly dismissed the thought. Everyone else seemed so genuine, so supportive. It didn't feel like something sinister. I told myself it was just a community of people helping one another grow. Nothing more. By the end of the evening, I felt strangely connected to the group. We exchanged numbers, and I agreed to attend their next gathering. I had no idea I was stepping into something far darker than I could have imagined. At that point in my life, I was searching for something, though I couldn't have told you what. I just turned 28 and felt like I was stuck in a never-ending loop. My job at a marketing firm wasn't exactly fulfilling, and most of my days were spent staring at a computer screen, churning out campaigns for products I didn't care about. Outside of work, my social life was lackluster, and I had this nagging feeling that I wasn't living up to my potential. I wasn't unhappy, exactly. I had friends, though most of them were more like acquaintances, and my family was supportive in their own distant way. Still, I often found myself lying awake at night, wondering if this was all there was to life. Those thoughts had started to weigh on me, creating a sense of dissatisfaction I couldn't shake. So, when I saw the flyer for the workshop, it felt like a sign, a chance to break free from the monotony and figure out what I really wanted. The people I met at the first gathering seemed to have something I didn't. They talked about their passions and goals with a kind of clarity and confidence that I envied. They shared stories of overcoming personal struggles and finding a deeper sense of purpose. Listening to them made me realize just how lost I felt in comparison. I wanted that sense of direction, that spark. When the group leader, whom everyone called Elliot, spoke, his words seemed to pierce right through me. He talked about shedding societal expectations, finding inner peace, and connecting with your true self. It wasn't anything I hadn't heard before, but the way he said it made it feel like a revelation. For the first time, I felt like someone understood the restlessness inside me. Elliot had this uncanny ability to make you feel seen, like he could read your soul. He wasn't pushy or overbearing. Instead, he had a calm, almost fatherly demeanor. During that second session, he approached me during a break and asked how I was feeling about everything. I told him I felt inspired but also unsure if I truly belonged there. He smiled and said, "The fact that you're here means you belong. The universe doesn't make mistakes." His words stuck with me. That was Elliot's gift. He knew how to say the right thing at the right time, leaving you feeling uplifted and validated. By the end of the evening, I'd shared things with the group that I hadn't even told my closest friends. It was liberating, but in hindsight, it was also the first step in letting my guard down completely. As the weeks went on, I became more involved with the group. They called themselves The Circle, and at first glance, they seemed like nothing more than a tight-knit community. The members were diverse: teachers, artists, business owners, and students, all drawn to Elliot's vision of a better life. They often spoke about how the circle had changed their lives, helping them find happiness and fulfillment. But there were small things that didn't sit right with me. For instance, new members were encouraged to attend multiple sessions a week, which required a donation to cover operational costs. At first, the donations were small, just enough to cover snacks and materials, but they quickly escalated. Elliot explained that the money was necessary to keep the circle running and expand its reach. "Investing in the group is investing in yourself," he would say. It wasn't just about money, though. Members were also expected to recruit others, spreading the message of the circle to their friends and family. Elliot framed it as a way to help others achieve the same enlightenment we had found. I wanted to believe in the vision, but deep down I started to feel uneasy. Despite my growing doubts, I kept attending the sessions. There was something magnetic about the circle. Its members were warm, supportive, and genuinely seemed to care about one another. It felt like a family, something I hadn't realized I was missing in my life. Every meeting ended with hugs, shared laughter, and promises to keep pushing forward together. That sense of belonging was intoxicating, and it kept me coming back. Elliot often spoke about the concept of universal energy, a force that connected all living things. He claimed that by aligning ourselves with this energy, we could unlock our true potential. To demonstrate, he conducted what he called energy sessions. In these exercises, we'd sit in a circle, holding hands, while Elliot guided us through deep breathing and visualization techniques. At the height of these sessions, some members claimed they could feel the energy coursing through them. Tingling sensations, bursts of warmth, even visions of light. I never felt anything that dramatic, but I didn't want to admit it. Everyone else seemed so convinced, and I didn't want to be the odd one out. One evening, after an especially intense session, Elliot pulled me aside and told me I had great potential. "You're closer than you think," he said, his voice low and serious. "But you're holding yourself back. Let go of your doubts, and you'll see what's waiting for you." His words filled me with a mix of hope and pressure. I wanted to believe him, to trust that he saw something special in me. Around this time, I noticed that members who had been with the circle the longest seemed to occupy higher positions within the group. They were given titles like guide or mentors and were often the ones leading smaller breakout sessions. I learned that these roles came with certain privileges: closer access to Elliot, decision-making power, and the chance to attend exclusive retreats. The catch? Becoming a guide required a significant financial contribution, something Elliot called a commitment to your spiritual growth. I couldn't ignore the red flags any longer. The more I observed, the more I realized that the circle wasn't as altruistic as it appeared. Yet, I couldn't bring myself to leave. I felt trapped between my unease and my desire to belong. Little did I know, the deeper I went, the harder it would be to escape. The turning point came when Elliot announced a weekend retreat, an event he described as the gateway to enlightenment. He claimed that only those ready to fully commit to their growth would be invited, and the rest would need to wait for another opportunity. The exclusivity of the retreat made it feel like a badge of honor, and I was eager to attend. However, there was one significant barrier: the cost. The fee for the retreat was astronomical, more than a month's rent for me. Elliot assured everyone that this was a necessary investment, not just in the retreat but in ourselves. He described it as a chance to shed the final layers of our old selves and emerge renewed. His words were persuasive, and many members, including me, scrambled to find the money. I ended up dipping into my savings, convincing myself it was worth it. The retreat took place in a secluded forest cabin, miles away from any town or cell phone signal. Upon arriving, we were asked to surrender our phones and any other distractions. "This weekend is about stripping away everything that holds you back," Elliot explained. The isolation was unnerving, but I convinced myself it was part of the process. The first night was intense. We sat around a bonfire while Elliot shared stories of people who had transformed their lives through the circle. He spoke with such conviction that it was hard not to believe him. Then came the exercises. We were paired up and told to share our most painful memories with each other, no matter how raw or personal. People cried, hugged, and opened up in ways I'd never seen before. I was no exception. I shared things I hadn't even admitted to myself. That night, I felt a strange mix of vulnerability and connection. It was as if the circle had peeled away my defenses, leaving me exposed but also strangely free. However, the next day would bring something far more unsettling. The second day of the retreat began with a ritual Elliot called the breaking. He explained that it was a transformative process designed to shatter the mental blocks that kept us from reaching our full potential. "You've all carried pain, doubt, and fear for too long," he said, his voice calm yet commanding. "Today you will let go of it all." We were led into a clearing in the woods where a series of stations had been set up. Each station represented a different challenge. At one, we were asked to scream our deepest fears into the open air. At another, we wrote down everything holding us back on a piece of paper and burned it in a small fire. These exercises felt cathartic, even empowering, but something about the atmosphere was growing darker. Elliot's demeanor shifted as the day went on. He became more intense, pushing participants to go further. "You're holding back," he would say, locking eyes with someone who hesitated. "You'll never be free if you don't give it everything." Some people broke down completely, collapsing into sobs or shouting in frustration. Elliot praised these moments as breakthroughs, encouraging everyone to cheer and support those whom let go. One of the final exercises involved a trust fall from a high platform into the arms of the group. When it was my turn, I hesitated. The platform seemed much higher than it had looked from the ground, and the people below felt impossibly far away. "You have to trust us," Elliot said, his voice firm. "If you can't trust the group, you'll never trust yourself." I took a deep breath and fell. The group caught me, and the adrenaline rush was overwhelming. For a moment, I felt exhilarated, like I had conquered something inside me. But as I looked around, I noticed something unsettling. Elliot's smile wasn't one of warmth or pride. It was something else, something that made my stomach turn. By the third and final day of the retreat, the atmosphere had shifted even further. The exercises, which had initially felt freeing, now seemed more like tests of loyalty. Elliot began speaking in terms of us versus them, emphasizing the importance of the circle and the dangers of the outside world. "Out there, people will judge you, misunderstand you, and try to tear you down," he said, gesturing toward the horizon. "But here you are safe. Here, you are understood." That morning, we were gathered into a circle and given blindfolds. Elliot explained that this exercise was about surrendering control and trusting the circle completely. We were led, one by one, through a series of physical and emotional challenges. Without sight, the experience was disorienting, and I couldn't tell how long it lasted. I remember stumbling over roots, hearing whispers, and feeling hands guiding me. By the time the blindfold was removed, I was sitting alone in the middle of the woods, with no one else in sight. Panic set in immediately. I called out, but no one answered. My heart raced as I tried to find my way back to the cabin. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled into a clearing where the rest of the group stood waiting. They erupted into cheers as I approached, and Elliot clapped me on the shoulder. "You've done it," he said. "You've proven your commitment." At that moment, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, confusion, and a gnawing sense of unease. Why was I proving my commitment to a group I barely knew? And why did it feel so much like a performance for Elliot's approval? That evening, Elliot held a final session by the bonfire. He spoke about how the circle was more than a community, it was a family. You've all taken the first steps toward true enlightenment, he said. But the journey is far from over. To continue, you must trust the circle completely and dedicate yourselves fully. For the first time, Elliot introduced the idea of leaving behind our old lives entirely. He spoke of members who had relocated to be closer to the circle, sacrificing jobs, relationships, and possessions. These things only hold you back, he said. Freedom comes from letting go. As he spoke, I looked around at the faces of my fellow members. Some were nodding, tears streaming down their cheeks, while others looked just as uncertain as I felt. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sense of belonging I had felt in the circle was starting to erode, replaced by questions I couldn't ignore. How far would this go? And what would Elliot ask of us next? The retreat ended the next morning with a closing ceremony. We gathered in a circle once more, holding hands as Elliot led us in a chant. The words were simple, but their repetition created a hypnotic rhythm. As the chant grew louder, I noticed a sense of euphoria spreading through the group. People were crying, laughing, and hugging one another as if they had just been reborn. I felt a pull to join in, but something in me resisted fully letting go. Before we left, Elliot handed out small silver pendants engraved with the circle's symbol, a minimalist design of interlocking loops. Wear this as a reminder of the bonds you've formed here, he said. It's a symbol of your commitment to yourself and to the circle. Everyone accepted the pendant eagerly, including me, though it felt more like a weight than a badge of honor as I slipped it around my neck. Back in town, I tried to resume my normal life, but the retreat had left an imprint on me. My coworkers commented on how I seemed different, calmer, more focused. I threw myself into work and avoided explaining where I had been, partly because I wasn't sure how to describe it. On the surface, I told myself it had been a transformative experience. Deep down, though, I couldn't shake the nagging doubts. The circle didn't let me retreat into my old routine for long. Within days, I received a call from one of the guides, inviting me to an advanced workshop. This time, the price tag was even higher. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, the guide assured me. You've come so far already. Don't let anything hold you back. I hesitated, but the pressure was relentless. Members I had bonded with at the retreat called and texted, encouraging me to attend. One even showed up at my apartment unannounced, insisting that it would be worth every penny. You'll regret it if you don't go, they said, their tone more insistent than supportive. The advanced workshop promised to be even more intense than the retreat, with sessions focusing on breaking the final barriers to enlightenment. Elliot himself called me a few days before the event, and his words carried a weight I couldn't ignore. You're so close, he said. I can see it in you. Don't let fear stop you now. I caved. Once again, I drained my savings to pay for the workshop. I told myself it was an investment in my future, but part of me knew I was sinking deeper into something I didn't fully understand. The advanced workshop began in a setting even more remote than the retreat, a sprawling estate surrounded by dense woods, with no cell service or internet access. From the moment I arrived, something felt different. The warm camaraderie of the previous events had been replaced by a palpable intensity. Everyone seemed on edge, as if bracing themselves for something monumental. Elliot greeted us at the gates, his usual smile replaced with a stern expression. This workshop is not for the faint of heart, he said, addressing the group. You are here because you have shown your dedication, but now we will separate the truly committed from those who are merely curious. The first exercise set the tone for the weekend. We were blindfolded and led into the woods, one by one, with only vague instructions to find your way back to the light. I stumbled through the darkness, my heart pounding as I tried to navigate the unfamiliar terrain. Branches scratched my arms, and I tripped over roots more than once. Panic started to creep in, but I forced myself to keep moving. After what felt like hours, I saw a flicker of light in the distance and staggered toward it. When I reached the clearing, I found the rest of the group waiting in silence, their faces unreadable. Elliot stood in the center, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "You've passed the first test," he said. "But the real work begins now." The rest of the day was a blur of physical and emotional challenges. We were deprived of food and sleep, pushed to our limits in grueling tasks that tested our endurance and resolve. One exercise involved standing in freezing water while reciting affirmations about our commitment to the circle. Another required us to confess our deepest fears in front of the entire group. By the second night, I was physically and emotionally drained. I began to question why I was putting myself through this. But every time doubt crept in, Elliot's words echoed in my mind. "You're closer than you think." The second night of the workshop brought the most unsettling experience yet. We were gathered in the main hall of the estate, the lights dimmed, with only a few candles casting flickering shadows on the walls. Elliot stood at the front, his voice calm but commanding. "Tonight, you will confront the darkness within," he said. "Only by facing it can you truly be free." The exercise began with us sitting in a circle, holding hands. Elliot instructed us to close our eyes and focus on our breathing. As his voice guided us deeper into a meditative state, the room grew eerily quiet. Suddenly, he began asking each of us pointed questions, probing into our insecurities and fears. "What are you most afraid of losing?" he asked one woman. "Who have you betrayed?" he asked another. When it was my turn, he asked, "What are you hiding from yourself?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't know how to answer. My mind raced, searching for something to say, but the truth was, I didn't fully understand what he was asking. Elliot waited, the silence stretching uncomfortably. "You can't move forward until you're honest," he said, his tone sharper than before. I mumbled something vague about feeling lost in life, but it didn't seem to satisfy him. "We'll come back to you," he said, moving on. Afterward, the group was split into pairs for a trust exercise. Each pair was given a task that required complete reliance on their partner, such as being blindfolded and led through an obstacle course or sharing an embarrassing secret. My partner, a man named Lucas, seemed trustworthy enough, but as the exercises went on, I noticed something strange. Lucas kept glancing at Elliot, as if seeking approval for everything he did. It was subtle, but it added to the growing unease I felt. The final exercise of the night was the most bizarre. We were asked to kneel in front of a large wooden box and place our hands inside without knowing what was inside. "This is a test of faith," Elliot said. "You must trust that the circle will not harm you." My heart raced as I reached into the box, half expecting to feel something sharp or slimy. Instead, my fingers brushed against something soft and cold, an empty void. When I pulled my hands out, Elliot smiled. "You see? The fear was only in your mind." The group applauded, but the experience left me shaken. I couldn't shake the feeling that Elliot was toying with us, testing how far we were willing to go. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed the events of the day, and a question began to form. Was this about enlightenment or control? For the first time, I wondered if I should leave the circle, but I wasn't sure I could anymore. The next morning, the final day of the workshop, began with an announcement that would change everything. Elliot gathered us in the main hall, his expression unusually grave. "Today," he said, "we will identify those among us who are truly ready to ascend to the next level of enlightenment. Not everyone will make it." The room fell silent. The weight of his words hung heavily in the air, and I could feel the tension rising among the group. Elliot went on to explain that we would undergo a ritual of ascension, which he described as the ultimate test of faith and dedication. He refused to elaborate, saying only that it would require absolute trust in the circle. The ritual took place in a secluded part of the estate, deep in the woods. We were blindfolded again and led in silence to the location. When the blindfolds were removed, we found ourselves standing in a clearing, surrounded by torches. At the center of the clearing was a large stone altar covered with symbols I didn't recognize. Elliot stepped forward, his voice rising as he addressed the group. "To ascend, you must let go of everything. Your doubts, your fears, and your ties to the outside world. Only then can you become truly free." He gestured to a wooden box at the base of the altar and began calling out names. One by one, members approached the box, took something from it, and stood before the group. When my name was called, I hesitated, my feet feeling like lead. The other members watched me intently as I approached the box and peered inside. It contained slips of paper, each with a name written on it. My own name stared back at me in bold letters. "This is your burden," Elliot said. "You must cast it into the fire and let go of who you were." I hesitated, my heart pounding. The fire crackled behind the altar, its flames casting eerie shadows on the faces of the group. Something about the ritual felt wrong, like I was being asked to give up more than just a piece of paper. I glanced at Elliot, who nodded encouragingly, but his eyes held a glint of something darker, expectation, maybe even control. Reluctantly, I walked to the fire and dropped the paper into the flames. The group cheered, but I felt no sense of release. If anything, the act only deepened my unease. What exactly was I letting go of? And what would be asked of me next? That night, as we prepared to leave the workshop, Elliot pulled me aside. "You've done well," he said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "But you still have far to go. The next step will be the hardest, but I believe in you." His words should have been reassuring, but they only filled me with dread. Whatever the next step was, I wasn't sure I wanted to take it. Returning home after the workshop, I felt like a stranger in my own life. The routines and comforts that had once grounded me now felt hollow. My coworkers' jokes, the hum of my office, and even my favorite coffee shop seemed insignificant compared to the intensity of what I'd experienced at the circle. And yet, that sense of unease persisted, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. Elliot's words echoed in my mind, "You still have far to go." I didn't know what he meant, but part of me was terrified to find out. The circle had become a central part of my life, consuming my time, energy, and money. My relationships outside the group had started to fray. Friends who used to call regularly now barely reached out, and when they did, I struggled to explain what I was involved in without sounding defensive or evasive. The circle didn't give me much time to reflect. Within days, I received another invitation, this time to join the Inner Circle, a select group of members chosen by Elliot himself. The honor was undeniable, but so was the cost, financially, emotionally, and physically. The price for entry was staggering, requiring not just money but a commitment to relocate closer to the group's headquarters, abandoning my current life entirely. When I expressed hesitation, I was met with concern from the guides. They assured me that doubt was natural, a sign that I was on the verge of a breakthrough. "It's fear of change," one of them told me. "Once you push past it, you'll see how much this can transform your life." I wanted to believe them, but the stakes felt too high. A week later, Elliot called me personally. His voice was calm but insistent. "I see so much potential in you," he said. "But potential means nothing if you don't act on it. This is your chance to step into the person you were meant to be." His words were compelling, but they also felt like a trap. For the first time, I wondered if his praise was less about me and more about how much control he could exert. Despite my reservations, I found myself drawn deeper into the circle's world. Elliot's promises of transformation and enlightenment were hard to resist, especially when so many others in the group seemed fully committed. Their glowing testimonials painted a picture of lives changed for the better, new careers, healed relationships, and an overwhelming sense of purpose. I began to wonder if I was the problem, the one holding myself back from achieving the same. But the cost of joining the Inner Circle loomed large in my mind. The financial commitment alone was staggering, requiring me to sell off personal belongings and dip into my savings yet again. The emotional cost, though, was even greater. Moving closer to the group meant leaving my current life behind. My apartment, my job, and the few friendships I still had. I couldn't help but ask myself, was I ready to give all of that up? And for what, exactly? The pressure from the circle didn't let up. Members I had once considered friends began to distance themselves when I expressed hesitation. They spoke in vague terms about how I wasn't ready or aligned with the group's values. Even Lucas, who had been my partner during the trust exercises, seemed colder and more detached. It was clear, In the circle, commitment wasn't optional, it was everything. One evening, Elliot called a special meeting for those who had been invited to join the inner circle but hadn't yet accepted. The room was smaller than usual, the atmosphere heavier. Elliot paced the floor, his presence commanding as ever. "The reason you're here," he said, "is because you're on the edge of something extraordinary. But some of you are holding back. Fear, doubt, attachment to the past, these things are chains. If you can't break them, you'll never be free." His words struck a chord, but not in the way he intended. For the first time, I saw the cracks in his facade. His confidence felt more like manipulation, his wisdom like a carefully crafted performance. And yet, when he turned his gaze to me, I felt the weight of the group's expectations pressing down, urging me to comply. The breaking point came during that meeting. After Elliot's speech, he asked us to share what was holding us back. One by one, people stood up, confessing their fears and doubts in front of the group. Many spoke of financial struggles, strained relationships, or lingering insecurities. Each time someone shared, Elliot responded with a mix of encouragement and subtle pressure. "You're so close," he would say. "Don't let fear win." When it was my turn, I hesitated. My mind raced with questions. Should I be honest? Should I tell them about the growing unease I felt, the sense that the circle was demanding too much? But as I looked around the room, I saw nothing but eager faces waiting for me to speak. The weight of their expectations was suffocating. "I'm afraid of losing myself," I finally said, my voice trembling. "I don't want to wake up one day and not recognize who I am." The room fell silent. For a moment, I thought Elliot would offer reassurance, tell me that my fears were valid and part of the process. Instead, his expression hardened. "That's exactly what's holding you back," he said, his voice sharp. "You're clinging to an old version of yourself that no longer serves you. The person you think you are is just a shell, and unless you're willing to let it go, you'll never find what you're looking for." His words cut deeper than I expected. I felt exposed, like he had taken my vulnerability and used it against me. The group nodded in agreement, their gazes filled with pity. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I sat down, feeling smaller than ever. That night, I lay awake in my bed, replaying the moment over and over. Elliot's words echoed in my mind, but so did my own. "I'm afraid of losing myself." The more I thought about it, the more I realized that fear wasn't irrational. It was a warning. The circle wasn't helping me find myself. It was erasing who I was and replacing it with something else. The next day, I made the decision to step back from the circle. It wasn't easy. Elliot had always said that doubt was the enemy, that it was a sign of weakness, and that leaving the group meant giving up on yourself. Those words echoed in my mind, but I couldn't ignore the growing unease that had taken root in my heart. Something about the circle felt wrong, and I needed distance to figure out what it was. When I shared my decision with a few members I trusted, their reactions were unsettling. Instead of understanding, I was met with concern, even alarm. "You can't leave now," one said. "You're so close to breaking through." Another warned, "If you walk away, you'll lose everything you've gained here." Their words sounded rehearsed, like lines from a script, and it only reinforced my suspicion that the circle was more about control than enlightenment. I decided to skip the next meeting. That small act of defiance felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders, but it also came with consequences. Within hours, I received multiple texts and calls from members, asking if I was okay and urging me to return. One message stood out. It was from Elliot himself. "You're on the verge of something great," he wrote. "Don't let fear drive you away." Despite the pressure, I stayed firm in my decision. But that wasn't the end of it. Over the next few days, members began showing up at my apartment unannounced, pleading with me to reconsider. They framed it as concern for my well-being, but their persistence felt invasive. One night, Lucas arrived with a gift, a book on self-discovery that Elliot often quoted from. "Just read it," he said. "You'll understand why this is so important." I took the book, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. Instead, I started researching groups like The Circle, how they operated, the tactics they used, and the warning signs of manipulation. The more I read, the more everything began to click. The circle wasn't about enlightenment, It was about control. Elliot's charm, the rituals, the constant pressure to commit, they were all part of a carefully crafted system designed to keep members dependent and compliant. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. I had spent months pouring my time, money, and energy into the circle, believing it would help me find myself. Now I saw it for what it was, a trap. The moment I decided to leave the circle for good, I felt a mix of relief and fear. Cutting ties with the group wasn't as simple as walking away. It meant unraveling months of emotional entanglement and confronting the hold Elliot had on me. But the more I thought about everything I'd experienced, the more determined I became to reclaim my life. The first step was setting boundaries. I blocked numbers from members who kept calling and ignored the barrage of texts urging me to return. I also stopped wearing the pendant they had given me at the retreat, a small but symbolic act that helped me feel less tethered to the group. It wasn't easy. Every step away felt like I was defying people who had once felt like family. But I knew it was necessary. My next step was reaching out to the friends and family I had distanced myself from during my time with the circle. Admitting what I'd been through was difficult. I felt ashamed for having been so deeply involved. But their reactions surprised me. Instead of judgment, I was met with compassion. My best friend, who I hadn't spoken to in months, said, "I'm just glad you're okay." I was worried something was wrong. With their support, I began piecing my life back together. I threw myself into work, rediscovered hobbies I'd abandoned, and slowly rebuilt my social circle. Each small step felt like a victory, a reminder that I didn't need the circle to find purpose or connection. But despite my progress, there was one lingering question I couldn't shake: how many others were still caught in the circle's web? That thought led me to dig deeper into the group's operations. I started connecting with former members online, people who had also left the circle and had their own stories to tell. What I learned was both shocking and validating. Many of them described experiences eerily similar to mine. Initial feelings of belonging and transformation, followed by escalating demands and subtle manipulation. Some had lost thousands of dollars, others had severed ties with loved ones, and a few were still struggling to rebuild their lives. Hearing the stories of other former members strengthened my resolve to take action. I couldn't sit back and let others fall into the same trap I had narrowly escaped. Some of the ex-members I spoke with had already begun documenting their experiences, sharing them anonymously on forums and blogs. Their bravery inspired me to do the same. I started writing my own account of my time in the circle, detailing everything from the initial workshops to the retreat and the pressure to join the inner circle. It was cathartic to put it all into words, but it was also a way to warn others. I wanted people to understand how easily these groups could draw you in, even when you thought you were too smart or skeptical to fall for manipulation. As I wrote, I realized just how methodical the circle had been in its tactics. Elliot's charm, the exercises designed to foster vulnerability, the escalating financial demands, it was all calculated to break down resistance and build dependency. The more I reflected, the more I saw how they had exploited people's insecurities and desires for belonging. Once my story was ready, I shared it online, anonymously at first. I didn't expect much of a response, but within days, I began receiving messages from people who had read it. Some thanked me for helping them recognize warning signs in groups they were involved in. Others shared their own experiences, echoing the same patterns of manipulation and control. A few even revealed they were current members of the circle, questioning their involvement for the first time. One message stood out. It was from a woman who had been on the verge of joining the inner circle when she stumbled across my story. She wrote, "Your words opened my eyes. I was about to sell everything to commit fully, but now I see what's really happening. Thank you for saving me." Her gratitude brought me to tears. For the first time since leaving, I felt like I had truly taken back my power. Buoyed by the response to my story, I began to explore ways to help others on a larger scale. The circle wasn't the only group using these tactics, and I realized that awareness was the most powerful tool to combat their influence. I reached out to some of the former members I'd connected with, suggesting that we work together to create resources for others who might be vulnerable to similar organizations. We formed a small support network, meeting virtually to share ideas and experiences. Our goal was to compile information about the tactics groups like the Circle used and provide guidance for people who felt trapped or unsure about their involvement. Together, we created a website, complete with articles, personal stories, and a list of red flags to watch for. The project gave me a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in months, I felt like I was using my experience for something meaningful. Every message from someone who had found the website and decided to leave their group felt like a victory. It reminded me that while my time in the Circle had been painful, it wasn't wasted. It had given me the tools to help others. But not everyone was happy about my newfound activism. One day, I received an email from someone claiming to be a current member of the Circle. The message was vague but threatening, warning me to stop spreading lies about the group. "You don't understand what you're doing," it read. "The Circle is bigger than you think, and Elliot won't let you tear it down." The email shook me, but it also confirmed what I had suspected. The Circle wasn't just a harmless self-help group. It was something far more insidious, and Elliot's reach extended further than I'd realized. I decided to share the email with the former members in our network. Some suggested going to the authorities, while others warned that it might provoke the Circle further. In the end, we decided to stay the course, focusing on education and support rather than direct confrontation. Despite the warning email, I refused to back down. If anything, it strengthened my resolve. The more I dug into the Circle's operations, the more disturbing the details became. Former members shared stories of financial ruin, emotional manipulation, and even estranged families. Some described how Elliot had used their vulnerabilities to maintain control, ensuring that leaving felt like an insurmountable task. One day, I stumbled upon a former member's blog that revealed something shocking. The Circle wasn't Elliot's first group. He had run similar organizations in other cities, each under a different name, before abruptly shutting them down and moving on. The blog detailed patterns of behavior that mirrored everything I had experienced: charismatic leadership, escalating demands, and the eventual collapse of trust. This revelation hit me hard. I had always thought of Elliot as the central figure of the Circle, but now I saw him as just one part of a much larger, more calculated system. It was clear that this wasn't about enlightenment or transformation. It was a business, built on exploiting people's need for connection and purpose. Armed with this knowledge, I reached out to journalists who specialized in exposing fraudulent organizations. One reporter, intrigued by the patterns I described, agreed to investigate further. Over the next few weeks, I provided them with everything I had: testimonies, documentation, and even the threatening email I had received. Other former members came forward as well, eager to share their experiences. When the article was finally published, it made waves. Titled "The Cult of the Circle," inside a network of exploitation, it exposed Elliot's history, the Circle's financial practices, and the emotional toll it had taken on its members. The piece went viral, sparking discussions online and even prompting law enforcement to look into the Circle's activities. The backlash was swift. Elliot released a statement denying the accusations, framing them as a smear campaign by disgruntled former members. But the damage was done. Membership numbers plummeted, and several key guides publicly left the group. The Circle began to crumble. With the Circle's downfall making headlines, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. On one hand, I was grateful that the truth had come to light and that others wouldn't fall into the same trap. On the other, I couldn't help but think about the people still inside the group, those who had given so much of themselves and now faced the daunting task of rebuilding their lives. I knew exactly how they felt because I had been there. Leaving the Circle wasn't just about walking away physically, it was about untangling the emotional web it had spun around me. Even as I watched the group unravel, I found myself replaying moments in my mind: Elliot's charismatic speeches, the camaraderie of the members, the fleeting sense of purpose I had felt. It was hard to reconcile the good memories with the manipulative reality. For a long time, I wondered if those moments of connection had been real or just another tool Elliot had used to keep us loyal. But as I reflected, I realized something important. The connections I had made weren't entirely false. The friendships, the support, and the vulnerability we shared were real. They just existed within a deeply flawed system. Those bonds didn't have to disappear because the Circle was gone. In fact, Some of the strongest relationships I had now were with former members who had also found their way out. In the months that followed, I focused on healing. Therapy became a lifeline, helping me process the guilt, anger, and confusion I felt. I learned to forgive myself for being drawn into the circle and for the time and money I had lost. More importantly, I began to see my experience not as a failure but as a lesson, one that had made me stronger and more aware of the power of manipulation. One of the most profound realizations I had during my recovery was that my involvement in the circle had stemmed from a deeply human need, a need for connection, meaning, and growth. Elliot had exploited those needs, but they weren't weaknesses. They were the very things that made me, and everyone else in the circle, human. Understanding that helped me reclaim those parts of myself without shame. I also began to rebuild relationships that had been strained during my time in the group. Reaching out to friends and family wasn't easy. Some of them had felt hurt or abandoned when I drifted away, and I had to acknowledge the impact my choices had on them. But their willingness to forgive reminded me of the strength of genuine connections, the kind that didn't require rituals or pledges to maintain. As I moved forward, I found new ways to channel the lessons I had learned. I joined local volunteer groups, reconnecting with the community in ways that felt authentic and fulfilling. I also continued working with a network of former members, helping them expand the resources we offered to those recovering from similar experiences. Every time someone reached out to thank us or share their own journey, it felt like a small victory, not just for them, but for all of us who had found the courage to leave. One day, I received an email from someone who had been deeply involved in the circle. They told me they had read the article exposing the group and felt torn about leaving. "I want to believe in what Elliot says," they wrote, "but I can't ignore the way he makes me feel, small, unworthy, and dependent. Is it possible to start over after this?" I wrote back, sharing my own experience and assuring them that leaving was possible, even if it felt impossible at first. "Starting over is hard," I wrote, "but it's also freeing. The life you rebuild will be yours, not shaped by someone else's expectations or control." A few weeks later, they emailed me again to say they had left the circle. Their words filled me with hope. For the first time in years, I feel like I can breathe again. The decision to speak out against the circle, while empowering, also came with challenges I hadn't anticipated. As much as I wanted to move on, there were moments when the past pulled me back. Sometimes it was a memory triggered by a phrase someone said or the sight of something as simple as a candlelit room. Other times, it was the guilt for the people I had encouraged to join, for the money I had poured into the group, and for the time I had lost chasing a false sense of purpose. But as I continued my journey, I realized that healing wasn't about erasing those memories. It was about learning to live with them, to accept that they were a part of my story. Instead of letting them weigh me down, I began to see them as reminders of how far I had come. They were proof of my resilience, my ability to face the truth, and my strength to rebuild. One of the most powerful moments of closure came during a gathering of former members. We decided to meet in person, a small group of us who had connected through the support network. Sitting in a circle, this time by choice, not by coercion, we shared our stories. It was emotional and cathartic, but it was also a celebration of our collective strength. For the first time, I saw the circle not as something that had broken us, but as something that had brought us together in a new, healthier way. As I reflected on my journey, I began to think about the people who were still searching, the ones who might stumble across groups like the circle in their quest for meaning. What could I say to them? What would I want them to know? The answer came to me slowly but clearly. You don't need to change who you are to find purpose. You don't need to prove your worth to anyone. The strength you're searching for is already within you. Looking back now, I can see how easy it is to fall into something like the circle. It starts with curiosity, a desire to improve yourself, to find a community, or to feel understood. And at first, it feels like you've found exactly what you've been searching for. The people seem genuine, the promises alluring, and the sense of belonging intoxicating. But over time, the cracks begin to show, and the cost of that belonging becomes too high. I've learned that it's okay to seek help, to want connection, and to strive for something more. But true growth doesn't come from surrendering yourself to someone else's vision of who you should be. It comes from embracing who you are, flaws and all, and finding strength in your own authenticity. If I could go back and speak to the version of myself who first walked into that workshop, I'd tell them this: you are enough as you are. You don't need a group, a leader, or a ritual to validate your worth. Trust yourself, even when it feels like the hardest thing to do. Today, my life isn't perfect, but it's mine. I've rebuilt relationships with the people who truly matter, found meaning in helping others, and rediscovered the joys of simply living without the constant need for approval or validation. The circle no longer holds any power over me, and for that, I am deeply grateful. As for Elliot and the circle, I know their story isn't over. People like him have a way of reappearing, rebranding, and finding new ways to exploit others. But I also know there are people out there ready to fight back, to speak the truth, and to help those who feel trapped. I'm proud to count myself among them. This journey has taught me that even the darkest experiences can lead to light if you're willing to confront them. Leaving the circle wasn't just about escaping, it was about reclaiming my life, my voice, and my power. And for that, I wouldn't trade the lessons I've learned for anything.